The words cut through the Norfolk Naval Base conference room like a blade through steel. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, you lack the strategic mindset for fleet command. You'll never make captain in my Navy. Admiral Robert Sterling's voice carried the authority of 35 years of naval service and 3 Silver Stars. Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson maintained perfect military bearing, but her green eyes flashed with something that wasn't defeat. It was quiet determination forged in adversity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months later, when Admiral Sterling's own life hung in the balance during the most dangerous rescue operation in the Atlantic's recent history, he would watch through satellite feeds as the same officer he had dismissed took command of a mission that no traditional commander would dare attempt. But that moment was still months away, and Emily Patterson had a long journey ahead of her. The morning sun painted the Chesapeake Bay in shades of gold and crimson as Emily walked across the pier toward her new assignment. The USS Charleston, a guided missile destroyer, represented everything she had worked toward in her 15-year naval career. At 34, Emily carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every promotion through competence under pressure, even when others questioned whether she belonged. Her father's words echoed in her memory as she approached the imposing warship. "Em, they'll always find reasons to doubt you. Your job is to prove them wrong through excellence, not anger." Captain James Patterson had served with distinction in the Gulf War before retiring to raise his daughter alone after her mother's death. His lessons about perseverance and integrity had shaped Emily's approach to every challenge she faced. The Charleston bustled with pre-deployment activity as sailors prepared for what would become the most significant humanitarian mission in the Atlantic Fleet's recent history. The destroyer would serve as the flagship for Operation Beacon Light, a complex rescue and relief operation designed to evacuate American civilians from the war-torn nation of Moldavia, where civil conflict had erupted into full-scale violence. Emily checked her watch, 06:15 hours. Early as always, a habit that had served her well throughout her career, though it never seemed to impress the right people at the crucial moments. As she climbed the steep gangway, Emily's mind focused on the challenges ahead. The Charleston would coordinate with multiple international partners to establish safe corridors for civilian evacuation while navigating the complex political dynamics of a region where allegiances shifted daily. The officer of the deck saluted as she boarded. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson, welcome aboard the Charleston. Captain Rodriguez is expecting you at the bridge at 700. Emily returned the salute crisply. "Thank you, Ensign. I'll find my way." She made her way through the destroyer's corridors, noting the controlled energy of a ship preparing for a challenging deployment. The Charleston would serve as the command vessel for Operation Beacon Light, coordinating with vessels from 6 allied nations to evacuate over 12,000 American civilians from increasingly dangerous territory. Emily had spent the previous 4 months developing the operational framework for the mission, creating contingency plans that ranged from diplomatic negotiations to potential combat operations. Her background in crisis management and international relations had earned her this assignment, though she knew some viewed her appointment through a lens colored by doubt about her capabilities. The bridge occupied the highest level of the destroyer's superstructure, offering commanding views of the naval base and surrounding waters. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided panoramic visibility, while banks of sophisticated displays showed real-time data from across the Atlantic Fleet. Captain Maria Rodriguez stood studying a digital map when Emily entered. Captain Rodriguez was a legend in naval circles, one of the first Hispanic women to command a destroyer and now a rising star in the Atlantic Fleet. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her brown eyes held the sharp intelligence that had earned her rapid advancement and widespread respect among peers and subordinates alike. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson," Captain Rodriguez turned with a professional smile, "right on time. I've been looking forward to working with you on Beacon Light. Thank you, Captain. I'm honored to be part of the operation. Rodriguez gestured toward the map display showing the complex geography of Moldavia's coastline, dotted with icons representing evacuation sites and potential hazards. Your operational plans for the mission are comprehensive, particularly your analysis of multi-vector threat scenarios. Most officers approach evacuation operations as logistics problems. You've treated this as a strategic challenge. Emily studied the display, noting the complex positioning of friendly forces and potential threats. Moldavia's civil war involves multiple factions, Captain. Any successful evacuation requires accounting for political dynamics, not just transportation logistics. We're not just moving people, we're navigating a complex web of competing interests. Exactly. Rodriguez's approval was evident, which is why Admiral Sterling specifically requested your assignment to this operation despite his reservations about your readiness for fleet command. The mention of Admiral Sterling brought back the memory of their confrontation 3 weeks earlier. Emily had presented a comprehensive strategy for modern evacuation operations that emphasized adaptive planning and real-time decision-making. Sterling had dismissed her approach as unnecessarily complex, arguing that traditional naval doctrine provided proven methods for civilian rescue operations. Their disagreement was professional but pointed. Sterling represented old-school naval thinking that emphasized clear hierarchies and established procedures. Emily advocated for flexible command structures that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The philosophical divide reflected larger tensions within the Navy about how to handle modern crises that didn't fit traditional military models. As if summoned by her thoughts, the bridge communication system crackled to life. Bridge, this is communications. Admiral Sterling is requesting a video conference with Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Commander Patterson at 0730. Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Admiral Sterling's involvement in operational details was unusual and suggested he remained skeptical about her role in the mission. His reputation for micromanaging operations he considered high risk was well known throughout the fleet. Captain Rodriguez noticed her reaction. Lieutenant Commander, Admiral Sterling can be challenging, but his strategic experience is invaluable. Focus on demonstrating your operational competence. The video conference began precisely at 7:30. Admiral Sterling's weathered face filled the main screen, his expression stern and businesslike. Behind him, Emily could see the familiar wood-paneled walls of his Norfolk office, decorated with photographs spanning decades of naval service and multiple combat deployments. Captain Rodriguez, Lieutenant Commander Patterson. Sterling's greeting was formal and direct. I've been reviewing the Beacon Light operational parameters. I have concerns about the complexity of the command structure you've proposed. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. What specific concerns, Admiral? The multi-tier coordination requirements seem unnecessarily complicated for what should be a straightforward evacuation operation. Traditional rescue operations have succeeded using established command hierarchies. This approach introduces variables that could compromise mission effectiveness. Emily recognized the criticism as an indirect attack on her planning methodology. She had designed Beacon Light to handle multiple simultaneous challenges: hostile forces, civilian panic, international coordination, and political complications, rather than treating evacuation as a simple transportation problem. Admiral Sterling, Emily interjected respectfully, the operational complexity reflects the actual challenges we face in Moldova. Recent intelligence indicates that multiple factions are actively targeting American civilians. Evacuation routes change hourly based on shifting battle lines. Traditional linear command structures can't adapt quickly enough to protect our people. Sterling's expression darkened. Lieutenant Commander, theoretical complexity and practical execution are different matters. Your academic approach to operations might work in staff colleges, but real rescues require proven methods and experienced leadership. The word academic carried a particular sting, implying that her expertise was purely theoretical rather than operational. Emily had led successful rescue operations in 3 different countries and coordinated civilian evacuations under hostile fire, but Sterling seemed determined to view her contributions as untested theory. Captain Rodriguez intervened smoothly. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Patterson's operational experience includes the Cyprus evacuation and the successful coordination of international rescue efforts during the Caribbean hurricane crisis. Her multi-tier approach reflects lessons learned from actual field operations. Those were small-scale operations, Sterling dismissed. Beacon Light involves 12,000 civilians across hostile territory. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, while competent at her current level, lacks the strategic perspective necessary for operation of this magnitude. The insult was delivered with bureaucratic precision, designed to undermine confidence without crossing into actionable territory. Emily felt her father's voice again. "Dignity under pressure, Em. Let your results speak louder than their doubts." "I understand your concerns, Admiral," Emily replied evenly. "Perhaps the mission results will provide the data needed to evaluate different operational approaches." Sterling's slight smile was condescending. "Lieutenant Commander, naval operations aren't experiments. They're life-and-death situations requiring proven leadership and tested methods." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of professional judgment. "You have potential, but thinking like this will ensure you never make captain. The Navy needs leaders who understand tradition and reliable procedures, not theoretical innovations that risk American lives." The silence that followed was profound. Captain Rodriguez's face remained neutral, but Emily could see tension in her posture. Such direct dismissal of an officer's promotion potential was highly irregular and bordered on unprofessional conduct. "Admiral," Rodriguez said carefully, "Lieutenant Commander Patterson's advancement will be determined by her performance and the Navy's requirements, not by adherence to any particular operational philosophy." "Of course," Sterling replied, though his tone suggested he considered the matter settled. "I trust the operation will proceed according to established protocols. Captain Rodriguez, I'll expect regular updates on operational progress." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The connection ended abruptly, leaving the bridge in uncomfortable silence. Emily stared at the blank screen, processing what had just occurred. Admiral Sterling hadn't just criticized her planning, he had publicly declared that her career would never advance beyond her current rank, essentially placing a ceiling on her aspirations based on his personal assessment of her methods. Captain Rodriguez turned to face her, concern evident in her expression. "Lieutenant Commander, I want you to know that Admiral Sterling's opinion doesn't reflect the Navy's assessment of your capabilities. Your innovations have saved lives and improved operational effectiveness." "I appreciate that, Captain," Emily replied, her voice steady and professional. "My focus remains on ensuring Beacon Light achieves its mission objectives and brings our people home safely." "Good." Rodriguez studied her for a moment longer. "Emily, if I may speak freely, you have something that very few officers possess: the ability to see complex situations clearly while managing critical details simultaneously. Don't let anyone convince you that capability is a weakness." As Captain Rodriguez returned to her operational planning, Emily moved to the bridge windows overlooking the harbor. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the impressive array of vessels preparing for deployment. Destroyers, frigates, and support ships formed a steel constellation around Charleston, each one representing years of training and preparation for exactly this type of humanitarian crisis. She thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in San Diego as the daughter of a Navy pilot and a nurse, military service had seemed natural rather than extraordinary. But her high school guidance counselor had recognized something special in her analytical abilities and suggested the Naval Academy's preparatory program. 4 years at Annapolis had transformed her from an uncertain teenager into a confident naval officer. Though the challenges of being one of only a handful of women in her operational specialty had taught her early lessons about persistence and professional excellence. Her first assignment aboard the frigate Hamilton had been a trial by fire, serving as the junior officer responsible for navigation and tactical coordination during a complex international rescue operation. The senior chief who became her mentor, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Thompson, had taught her that effectiveness in the Navy was earned through competence under pressure and the ability to make sound decisions when lives depended on accuracy. Over the years, Emily had commanded progressively more complex operations and taken on assignments that tested her ability to coordinate between different military services, government agencies, and international partners. Her expertise in crisis management had developed through real-world experience in challenging environments around the globe. The Cyprus evacuation that Captain Rodriguez had mentioned involved coordinating the rescue of 800 American civilians during a sudden eruption of sectarian violence, requiring split-second decisions about safe routes and extraction priorities while managing relationships with multiple competing military forces. But success, Emily had learned, could be interpreted differently depending on who was evaluating the results. Some superiors saw her achievements as proof of exceptional capability and innovative thinking. Others, like Admiral Sterling, seemed to view them as dangerous departures from established doctrine that succeeded despite their unconventional nature rather than because of their strategic soundness. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same analytical thinking that made her effective in complex humanitarian crises was being criticized as too theoretical for traditional naval operations. She was being told simultaneously that her methods were too innovative and too academic, too focused on details and too concerned with big-picture strategic implications. A knock on the bridge hatch interrupted her thoughts. A young ensign entered and saluted. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson, Captain Rodriguez, the department heads are assembled for the Beacon Light final briefing." Emily checked her watch. The morning had passed more quickly than she realized. In 45 minutes, she would be presenting the operational framework for the largest civilian evacuation in recent Atlantic Fleet history to senior officers from 6 different navies, each with their own protocols and concerns about American leadership in international humanitarian operations. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on her. Hours after being told she would never advance beyond her current rank, she was about to demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking that few officers at any level could match. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the bridge, Emily allowed herself one last look at the harbor. Somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, 12,000 American civilians were trapped in an increasingly violent conflict, depending on the Navy's ability to extract them safely from a situation that grew more dangerous by the hour. When that crisis reached its peak, the question wouldn't be whether her strategies were too innovative or too complex. The question would be whether they could save lives when traditional approaches had already failed. Emily Patterson intended to make sure they did. The main briefing auditorium aboard the USS Charleston filled rapidly as senior officers from 6 allied nations took their seats for the Operation Beacon Light coordination meeting. Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson stood at the podium, her presentation materials arranged with military precision, while massive digital displays behind her showed the scope of the humanitarian crisis unfolding across Moldova's coastline. Captain Rodriguez entered with the international delegation, and Emily noted the diverse array of uniforms representing navies from Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Each officer brought decades of experience and deeply held beliefs about proper evacuation procedures. Convincing this group to embrace her adaptive coordination approach would require more than theoretical explanations. It would demand demonstrable results under pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Rodriguez began, "Operation Beacon Light represents the most comprehensive multinational civilian evacuation in Atlantic Fleet history. Lieutenant Commander Patterson will brief you on the operational framework and coordination protocols that will guide our mission." Emily activated the first display, showing traditional evacuation models used for the past 30 years. Historically, large-scale civilian evacuations have followed sequential processing protocols: establish secure perimeters, identify extraction points, organize civilian groups, and execute systematic transportation to safety. Each phase completed before beginning the next, with centralized command controlling all decisions. She advanced to the next display, revealing a dramatically different approach. Beacon light introduces dynamic response coordination. Rather than waiting for perfect security conditions that may never materialize, we'll simultaneously manage multiple extraction sites, adaptive route planning, real-time threat assessment, and flexible resource allocation, all operating within constantly changing timeframes and threat environments.
Commander Jacques Dubois from the French Navy raised his hand immediately. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, this approach seems to abandon proven safety protocols in favor of uncontrolled complexity. How do we ensure civilian protection when multiple operations proceed without centralized oversight? Emily had expected this concern and prepared her most compelling counterargument. Commander Dubois, Moldova's civil war involves 7 different armed factions whose territorial control changes hourly. Waiting for stable security conditions would mean waiting while American civilians face increasing danger from groups that specifically target foreign nationals. She clicked to a detailed intelligence briefing showing recent faction movements. In the past 72 hours alone, 3 evacuation sites have become inaccessible due to shifting battle lines. 2 civilian gathering points have been attacked by extremist groups. Traditional sequential protocols would have left thousands of Americans trapped while we waited for security conditions that will never exist. Captain Hans Müller from the German Navy leaned forward. Assuming we accept the need for simultaneous operations, how do you prevent resource conflicts and communication breakdowns when multiple extraction teams compete for the same assets? Emily had spent months developing the solution to this exact challenge. Through distributed command authority and predictive resource allocation, Commander Müller. Rather than centralizing all decisions through a single command structure, Beacon Light establishes regional coordination centers with autonomous operational capability within defined parameters. She activated an animated display showing the command structure in action. Each coordination center manages specific geographical areas and civilian populations, but maintains constant communication with adjacent centers. When situations change or escalate, the network automatically adjusts resource distribution and command authority to match evolving requirements. Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Ricci from the Italian Navy studied the display intently. This requires unprecedented coordination between different national procedures and communication systems. How do you ensure compatibility when our forces have never trained together using these methods? Through standardized interface protocols developed specifically for multinational humanitarian operations, Emily replied. Each nation retains its internal command structure and operational procedures, but interfaces with the coordination network through common communication standards and shared situational awareness systems. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as officers discussed the implications among themselves. Emily recognized the mixture of professional interest and institutional skepticism on their faces. What she was proposing represented a fundamental shift in how multinational forces would coordinate during humanitarian crises, potentially setting precedents for future operations worldwide. Commander Sarah Williams from the Royal Navy raised a concern that Emily knew would resonate with traditionalists throughout the room. Lieutenant Commander, evacuation operations rely on proven procedures and clear command hierarchies for good reason. Lives depend on reliable methods. Aren't we risking civilian safety by implementing untested coordination systems during an active crisis? Emily had anticipated this objection and prepared her most important response. Commander Williams, let me share some data from recent evacuation operations. She displayed classified analysis that had been cleared for international sharing. Analysis of the Somalia evacuation shows that traditional sequential protocols required 14 hours to establish secure extraction for 4,000 civilians. The Lebanon crisis demonstrated similar delays, with 12-hour processing times that left civilians exposed to escalating violence. She advanced to the next slide, showing comparative projections. Predictive modeling indicates that traditional methods would require 36 to 48 hours to complete Moldova evacuations, during which time civilian casualties could reach 20% based on current violence escalation patterns. Dynamic coordination reduces extraction time to 8 to 12 hours, potentially saving thousands of lives. The numbers carried their intended impact. Military officers understood that in humanitarian crises, time measured lives saved or lost. Reducing evacuation duration from days to hours wasn't just an improvement, it was the difference between mission success and humanitarian disaster. Admiral Pierre Moreau from the French delegation spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had overseen multiple international crisis responses. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, assuming your coordination system functions as projected, how do you maintain operational security when multiple teams operate with autonomous authority? Coordination networks can become intelligence vulnerabilities. Emily smiled slightly, recognizing the sophisticated nature of the question. Through layered security protocols and compartmentalized information sharing, Admiral, the coordination network operates on multiple security levels, with tactical teams receiving only information necessary for their immediate operations. Strategic intelligence remains restricted to senior command levels, while routine coordination uses encrypted but lower classification channels. She demonstrated the security interface on the main display. Field commanders receive real-time updates about their operational areas without accessing broader strategic information. If any network segment is compromised, affected areas automatically isolate while maintaining operational capability through backup systems. Captain Rodriguez had remained silent during most of the briefing, but now addressed the assembled officers. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to emphasize that Lieutenant Commander Patterson's coordination methods have been successfully tested under actual crisis conditions. Her innovations during the Cyprus evacuation achieved results that traditional methods could not have matched. Commander Williams studied Emily with renewed interest. Lieutenant Commander, could you walk us through a specific scenario to demonstrate how your coordination system would handle a complex multi-site evacuation under hostile conditions? Emily had hoped for this opportunity. She activated a comprehensive simulation showing Moldova's coastline with multiple threat indicators and civilian populations. Scenario: 7,000 civilians scattered across 5 coastal cities, each controlled by different factions, with varying hostility toward foreign intervention. Simultaneously, we face artillery bombardment of evacuation sites, civilian panic blocking transportation routes, hostile forces targeting rescue teams, and political complications from neighboring countries questioning our authority to operate. The display showed the scenario unfolding, with traditional response methods struggling to address multiple simultaneous challenges. Using current procedures, we would prioritize the largest civilian concentration, establish security perimeters, negotiate with controlling factions, then systematically process each location. Sequential approach requiring 60 to 70 hours for complete evacuation. She switched to her dynamic coordination approach, showing multiple coordination centers activating simultaneously across the region. With distributed command authority, evacuation begins immediately at all 5 sites, while specialized teams address artillery threats, route clearance, faction negotiations, and political coordination simultaneously. AI-optimized resource allocation prevents conflicts while maximizing extraction efficiency.
The simulation showed response times, civilian safety metrics, and mission completion rates across all operational areas. Where traditional methods would have left critical populations exposed for days, the integrated approach provided comprehensive coverage within hours. Commander Dubois studied the results carefully. Impressive simulation, Lieutenant Commander, but simulations can be programmed to validate any approach.
How do we know this would work under actual crisis conditions with real civilians facing genuine terror? Emily had expected this challenge and prepared her most significant revelation. Commander, this isn't just a simulation. These protocols were successfully tested during the Cyprus emergency operation 18 months ago. The briefing room fell silent. The Cyprus evacuation had been classified, but every senior officer knew that something extraordinary had occurred during that crisis, something that demonstrated unprecedented coordination between international forces under extreme pressure. Captain Rodriguez nodded permission for Emily to continue. A coordinated attack by extremist groups tested our response capabilities across multiple domains simultaneously. Traditional sequential protocols would have resulted in civilian casualties exceeding 40%. Instead, using early versions of these coordination systems, international forces successfully evacuated 800 Americans with 0 casualties while maintaining complete operational security. She displayed declassified portions of the after-action report. Evacuation time, 11 hours for complete multi-site extraction. Resource efficiency, 91% optimization across all participating units. Mission success, complete with 0 civilian casualties and minimal political complications. The numbers spoke louder than any theoretical argument. 11 hours for complete evacuation of a complex multi-site operation represented a revolutionary improvement in humanitarian response capability. 0 civilian casualties during a coordinated extremist attack demonstrated the practical value of her innovative approach. Lieutenant Colonel Ritchie asked the question everyone was considering. Lieutenant Commander, if these protocols were so successful, why hasn't this information been more widely distributed throughout NATO humanitarian response planning? Because, Captain Rodriguez interjected, the Cyprus operation was specifically designed to test coordination capabilities under actual crisis conditions. Revealing our methods would compromise operational security for future humanitarian missions where similar approaches might be necessary. Emily nodded agreement. Beacon Light represents the first opportunity to train multinational forces in these protocols under controlled conditions before implementing them during an active humanitarian crisis. Success here could revolutionize how allied nations coordinate during civilian evacuation operations. The weight of this revelation transformed the atmosphere in the briefing room. What had seemed like an experimental approach now appeared as preparation for proven methods that had already demonstrated life-saving effectiveness under actual combat conditions. The officers weren't being asked to risk civilian lives on untested theories. They were being invited to implement coordination systems that had already proven superior to traditional methods. Commander Williams was the first to speak after the extended silence. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, assuming we proceed with your coordination protocols, what specific preparations are required from each participating Navy? Emily felt the shift in the room's energy. Questions were no longer challenging the fundamental concept, but focusing on implementation details and practical requirements. Officers who had initially resisted the concept now contributed suggestions for improvement and adaptation to their specific national capabilities and procedures. The transformation wasn't complete. Several senior officers remained visibly uncomfortable with such a radical departure from established methods, but professional pragmatism was overcoming institutional resistance. Admiral Moreau made an observation that surprised everyone in the room. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, your coordination approach resembles certain theoretical frameworks discussed in advanced humanitarian planning circles. Have you consulted with academic crisis management institutions during your development process? Emily recognized both the compliment and the potential trap hidden within the question. Academic consultation could be interpreted as proof that her ideas were theoretical, undermining the credibility she had just established. Admiral, the coordination protocols were developed through operational experience and tested under actual crisis conditions. Academic theory informed some aspects of our approach, but practical effectiveness and life-saving capability drove the entire development process. As the briefing concluded, Captain Rodriguez addressed the assembled officers. Ladies and gentlemen, Operation Beacon Light will proceed according to Lieutenant Commander Patterson's coordination framework. Detailed implementation schedules will be distributed this afternoon. Prepare your staff for intensive training over the next 10 days before we reach Moldovan waters. The international officers filed out in small groups, their conversations animated with the discussion of the coordination protocols and their implications for future humanitarian operations. Emily remained at the podium organizing her materials while processing the session's success. She had convinced 6 allied navies to embrace a radical departure from traditional evacuation methods. No small achievement considering the institutional resistance to change that characterized military organizations worldwide. Captain Rodriguez approached as the last officers left the briefing auditorium. Outstanding presentation, Lieutenant Commander. That was one of the most effective coordination briefings I've witnessed in 20 years of naval service. You've given our people the tools they need to save lives. Thank you, Captain. I hope the operation validates their confidence in these methods. It will, Rodriguez replied with conviction. But you should know that Admiral Sterling has been making additional inquiries about beacon light operational parameters. He's particularly interested in any deviations from standard Atlantic Fleet evacuation protocols. Emily felt a familiar tension in her stomach. Sterling's opposition to her career advancement was becoming active interference with her current assignment, potentially jeopardizing the success of a mission where thousands of civilian lives hung in the balance. Has he raised specific operational concerns? Nothing official yet, Rodriguez said carefully, but informal conversations suggest he believes the operation is unnecessarily complicated and potentially destabilizing to traditional Allied coordination methods. He's also questioning whether your coordination systems have been adequately tested for an operation of this magnitude.
The implication was clear. Success wouldn't necessarily protect Emily from Sterling's influence, and any problems during the operation would certainly be used to validate his assessment of her capabilities and judgment. The stakes for Operation Beacon Light had just become intensely personal, with her career and potentially thousands of civilian lives hanging in the balance. As Emily left the briefing auditorium and walked through Charleston's corridors toward her quarters, she reflected on the morning's events. In 4 hours, she had convinced experienced naval officers from 6 nations to embrace revolutionary changes in humanitarian coordination methods. The same strategic thinking that Admiral Sterling dismissed as academic theory had just gained international support from some of the world's most respected naval professionals. But Emily knew that success in the briefing room was only the beginning. Operation Beacon Light would test her coordination protocols under conditions designed to simulate the chaos and uncertainty of an actual humanitarian crisis. If the mission succeeded, it could transform international evacuation coordination and validate her approach to modern crisis management. If it failed, Sterling's prediction about her career would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and worse yet, thousands of American civilians would pay the price for her innovations. The next 10 days would determine everything. 10 days to train multinational forces in coordination methods that challenged every traditional assumption about evacuation operations. 10 days to prepare for a mission where success would be measured not in military objectives achieved, but in human lives saved or lost. Emily Patterson had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, even though she hadn't known it was coming. Every challenge, every success, every lesson learned from senior mentors had been leading toward a humanitarian crisis where her innovations would either save thousands of lives or fail catastrophically under the weight of institutional resistance and operational complexity. The next 10 days would determine everything. 10 days to train multinational forces in coordination methods that challenged every traditional assumption about evacuation operations. 10 days to prepare for a mission where success would be measured not in military objectives achieved, but in human lives saved or lost. Emily Patterson had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, even though she hadn't known it was coming. Every challenge, every success, every lesson learned from senior mentors had been leading toward a humanitarian crisis where her innovations would either save thousands of lives or fail catastrophically under the weight of institutional resistance and operational complexity. The next 10 days would determine
everything. 10 days to train multinational forces in coordination methods that challenged every traditional assumption about evacuation operations. 10 days to prepare for a mission where success would be measured not in military objectives achieved, but in human lives saved or lost. Emily Patterson had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, even though she hadn't known it was coming. Every challenge, every success, every lesson learned from senior mentors had been leading toward a humanitarian crisis where her innovations would either save thousands of lives or fail catastrophically under the weight of institutional resistance and operational complexity. The storm was gathering across the Atlantic, both literally and figuratively. And Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson stood at its center, ready to prove that the future of humanitarian operations belonged to those willing to embrace complexity rather than retreat into familiar simplicity. 10 days into Operation Beacon Light's training phase, Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson stood in the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Charleston, watching her coordination protocols transform 6 Allied navies into a unified humanitarian response force. The massive wall displays showed a living map of the North Atlantic, dotted with icons representing 47 vessels from multiple nations, all moving in coordinated patterns as they practiced the most complex civilian evacuation procedures ever attempted. The transformation had been remarkable. What began as skeptical cooperation from international allies had evolved into enthusiastic adoption of her methods. French destroyers coordinated seamlessly with German frigates, while Canadian submarines provided intelligence to Spanish patrol boats. The artificial intelligence coordination system processed thousands of communication exchanges per hour, allowing human commanders to focus on life-saving decisions rather than routine logistics management. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Emily's deputy operations officer, approached with the latest training efficiency reports. Lieutenant Commander, response times are averaging 9 minutes across all evacuation scenarios. Resource conflicts have dropped to less than 1%, and Allied commanders are reporting the highest confidence ratings in Atlantic Fleet training history. Emily studied the data with professional satisfaction tempered by growing concern. Success at this level would inevitably attract scrutiny from Norfolk, and she knew Admiral Sterling was monitoring every aspect of the training operation with increasing interest. Excellence that challenged established doctrine could be as dangerous to her career as failure, especially when it came from an officer he had already written off. "Any communication from Fleet Command?" Emily asked, noting the time display showing 13:45 hours. "Captain Rodriguez received a priority message from Admiral Sterling's office 40 minutes ago," Chen replied carefully. "She's requested your presence in the secure conference room at 14:30 hours." Emily checked her chronometer, 15 minutes to prepare for what could be career-defining news. She spent the time reviewing training statistics and operational reports, ensuring she could defend every aspect of Beacon Light's performance with concrete evidence. If Sterling was going to challenge her methods, she would counter with irrefutable proof of their effectiveness. The secure conference room occupied the most protected section of the Charleston, designed for conversations requiring absolute classification levels. Captain Rodriguez stood at the conference table, her expression carefully neutral as Emily entered and saluted. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson, please be seated. We have significant developments to discuss regarding Operation Beacon Light." Emily took her position, noting the encrypted communication equipment active on the conference table. Whatever news awaited required real-time coordination with higher authorities, suggesting developments beyond routine training evaluation. "First, the positive news," Rodriguez began. "Beacon Light training exercises have exceeded every performance metric established for multinational humanitarian operations. Coordination efficiency, resource utilization, scenario completion rates, and Allied satisfaction scores are all record-breaking. Your protocols are being studied by humanitarian planning departments across the Atlantic Fleet." Emily felt a moment of pride before Rodriguez's expression grew serious. However, Admiral Sterling has formally requested a comprehensive review of the training parameters and your role in developing them. He's particularly concerned about what he terms unauthorized modifications to established evacuation doctrine.
The phrase carried ominous implications. Unauthorized modifications suggested insubordination regardless of results. In military culture, following proper procedures often mattered more than achieving superior outcomes, especially when those outcomes challenged institutional assumptions about effective leadership. "Captain, every aspect of Beacon Light was approved through appropriate channels," Emily said carefully. "Documentation shows explicit authorization for the coordination protocols and multi-site evacuation framework."
"I know," Rodriguez replied. "But Sterling is questioning whether those approvals were based on complete information about the scope of changes you were implementing. He's also raising concerns about your use of artificial intelligence systems that weren't fully evaluated through standard Navy testing procedures." Emily felt her stomach tighten. The AI coordination system had been developed using rapid prototyping methods that bypassed traditional evaluation timelines, a necessity given the urgent humanitarian crisis, but potentially problematic from a bureaucratic perspective. "The AI system underwent extensive validation during the Cyprus evacuation," Emily replied. "Real-world testing under actual crisis conditions should supersede laboratory evaluation requirements." "In principle, yes," Rodriguez agreed. "But Sterling is arguing that using an unvetted system during Beacon Light training without explicit approval represents a violation of operational safety protocols." The accusation was technically accurate, but strategically absurd. Emily had used a system proven effective under actual humanitarian crisis conditions, but hadn't completed paperwork that could have taken months while civilians died waiting for bureaucratically approved rescue methods. "Captain, is Admiral Sterling recommending specific actions regarding my involvement in the operation?" Rodriguez's expression grew grave. "He's requested that you be relieved of coordination authority pending a formal investigation into your adherence to established procedures. Commander David Walsh will arrive tomorrow to assume temporary control of the training protocols." The news hit Emily like a physical blow. Commander Walsh was a traditionalist whose approach to evacuation operations hadn't evolved significantly in 15 years. His assumption of command would effectively end the integrated coordination that had made Beacon Light so successful, potentially condemning thousands of civilian evacuees to the inefficiencies and delays of outdated procedures. "Captain, respectfully, Commander Walsh has no experience with dynamic coordination protocols. Transferring authority during active training could compromise operational readiness and potentially endanger civilian lives when we reach Moldovan waters." "I've made those exact arguments to Admiral Sterling," Rodriguez replied. His response was that traditional command structures have proven reliability, while your innovations represent unacceptable risks regardless of their apparent success. Emily struggled to process the logic. Her methods had demonstrably superior results, proven effectiveness under actual crisis conditions, and enthusiastic support from international allies. Yet she was being relieved for prioritizing life-saving efficiency over bureaucratic compliance. "Is there any avenue for appeal or delay?" "Limited options," Rodriguez admitted. "The investigation will take several weeks, during which time you'll be restricted to advisory roles. Commander Walsh will implement traditional evacuation protocols for the remainder of training and the actual operation." Emily understood the implications immediately. Traditional protocols would reduce operational effectiveness, disappoint Allied participants, and validate Sterling's criticism of her approach. Any problems during the actual evacuation wouldn't be attributed to the abandonment of her methods. They would be blamed on the disruption caused by changing leadership mid-operation. Before Emily could respond, the conference room's secure communication system activated. Admiral Patricia Walsh, commander of the Atlantic Fleet, appeared on the main display. Her 3 stars and reputation for strategic innovation commanded immediate attention from both officers. "Captain Rodriguez, Lieutenant Commander Patterson, I've been monitoring the situation regarding Operation Beacon Light and Admiral Sterling's concerns about procedural compliance." Emily remained silent, knowing that Admiral Walsh's words would determine her immediate future and potentially her entire career trajectory. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson, your coordination protocols represent the most significant advancement in humanitarian response coordination in the past 3 decades. Beacon Light training metrics exceed every historical benchmark for multinational evacuation operations." Emily felt a surge of hope. quickly tempered by Admiral Walsh's serious expression. However, Admiral Sterling has raised procedural concerns that cannot be ignored within current command structures. The Pentagon requires absolute confidence in authorization and testing protocols for any systems used during major humanitarian operations. Admiral Walsh paused, studying Emily through the video connection. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson, I'm going to offer you a choice that I've never presented to an officer at your rank." The option was clearly unacceptable. Career suicide disguised as bureaucratic process. Option 2. I'm authorizing an emergency deployment of your coordination protocols under actual operational conditions. Intelligence indicates that Moldovan civilian situations have deteriorated beyond all projections. Multiple armed factions are actively targeting American civilians for political leverage. If you're willing to assume full responsibility for the coordination systems, Beacon Light will transition from training to active humanitarian operations. Emily's mind raced through the implications. Active operations would validate her methods under real crisis conditions, but failure would end her career and potentially cost civilian lives. Success would vindicate her approach, but might not overcome Sterling's bureaucratic opposition.
Admiral Walsh, what are the specific parameters of the civilian threat situation? Coordinated attacks on American residential compounds, systematic targeting of evacuation routes, hostage-taking for political negotiations, and complete breakdown of local security forces. Exactly the multi-site crisis scenario your protocols were designed to address. Emily realized that Moldavian factions had been monitoring international humanitarian preparations and planned their escalation to exploit traditional evacuation response limitations. Her coordination protocols represented the only realistic defense against their sophisticated strategy. "Admiral, I accept full responsibility for the coordination systems during active humanitarian operations." Admiral Walsh nodded approvingly. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson, as of this moment, you have operational authority over all Beacon Light assets for humanitarian rescue operations. Captain Rodriguez will provide administrative support, and Commander Walsh's arrival will be delayed pending resolution of the active crisis." Emily felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders. 47 vessels from 6 nations, thousands of sailors, and the lives of 12,000 American civilians now depended on coordination protocols that Admiral Sterling considered unauthorized experiments. "Admiral Walsh, what are my authorities regarding engagement rules and international coordination?" "Full humanitarian rescue authorities under international maritime law. Engage any hostile actions according to established rules of engagement for civilian protection. Your coordination protocols are hereby approved for active operations under emergency authorization." The emergency authorization was exactly what Emily needed, official approval that superseded normal bureaucratic requirements. Sterling couldn't challenge procedures that had been explicitly authorized by the Atlantic Fleet Commander during active humanitarian operations. As the communication ended, Captain Rodriguez turned to Emily with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Lieutenant Commander, you understand what you've just accepted. If this operation fails, Sterling will have everything he needs to end your career. Success might not be enough to protect you from his institutional influence." Emily stood, her decision made. "Captain, my career isn't worth risking civilian lives by using inferior coordination methods. If Admiral Sterling wants to end my advancement because I prioritized saving American civilians over bureaucratic compliance, so be it." Rodriguez nodded with evident respect. "Very well, Lieutenant Commander. What are your immediate requirements for transitioning from training to active operations?" Emily was already mentally restructuring the coordination protocols for real-world humanitarian engagement. "First, I need secure communication with all Allied commanders to brief them on the operational transition. Second, intelligence updates on faction positions and civilian locations. Third, authorization to modify training scenarios to match actual threat patterns." "You'll have everything within 2 hours," Rodriguez assured her. "Lieutenant Commander, for what it's worth, this is the kind of leadership decision that saves lives and creates legends in naval history." Emily allowed herself a slight smile, or cautionary tales about officers who exceeded their authority and got people killed.
As she left the conference room and returned to the Combat Information Center, Emily knew that the next 72 hours would determine everything. Her coordination protocols would face their ultimate test under conditions that could validate or destroy her career, while determining the fate of thousands of innocent civilians. Sterling's prediction about her future would either be proven correct or thoroughly discredited. But Emily also knew something that Sterling couldn't understand. Her methods worked because they reflected the reality of modern humanitarian crises rather than the comfort of traditional procedures. The Moldavian crisis would test not just her coordination protocols, but the fundamental question of whether innovation could overcome institutional resistance when human lives hung in the balance. The storm was gathering across the Atlantic, both meteorologically and politically, and Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson stood at its center, ready to prove that the future of humanitarian operations belonged to those willing to embrace complexity rather than retreat into familiar procedures. As she began issuing orders to transition Beacon Light from training to active rescue operations, Emily felt the weight of history pressing upon her decisions. Somewhere across the ocean, American families were trapped in an increasingly violent conflict, depending on the Navy's ability to extract them safely from a situation that grew more dangerous by the hour. She intended to bring them home, regardless of what it cost her personally. And, unknown to Emily, within days she would face an even greater challenge. Admiral Sterling himself would become trapped in the very crisis he had dismissed as manageable through traditional methods, requiring the innovative coordination protocols he had spent months trying to destroy. The irony would be complete, but first Emily had to prove that her methods could work under the most challenging humanitarian conditions imaginable. 12,000 civilian lives depended on her being right, and Admiral Sterling's career, though he didn't know it yet, would soon depend on her success as well. The Combat Information Center aboard the USS Charleston had transformed into the nerve center of the largest humanitarian rescue operation in Atlantic Fleet history. Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson stood before the massive display wall, watching as her coordination protocols orchestrated the movements of 47 vessels across thousands of square miles of increasingly hostile waters. What had begun as Operation Beacon Light training 18 hours ago was now Operation Safe Harbor, an active rescue mission to extract 12,000 American civilians from a war zone that grew more dangerous by the hour. Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb approached with the latest satellite reconnaissance data, his expression grim. "Lieutenant Commander, Moldavian faction activity has intensified dramatically. We're tracking at least 15 armed groups moving towards civilian population centers. The Revolutionary Guard has established roadblocks on all major evacuation routes, and the People's Liberation Front is systematically targeting foreign residential compounds." Emily studied the developing threat pattern with growing concern. The Moldavian factions weren't simply taking advantage of civil war chaos. They were implementing a sophisticated strategy designed to overwhelm traditional humanitarian response systems. Civilian populations were being deliberately scattered and isolated, while armed groups positioned themselves to exploit any gaps in rescue coordination. "What's the status of our coordination nodes?" Emily asked, her fingers working the command interface to track real-time developments across 5 different crisis zones. "All 6 nodes are operational and maintaining real-time communication," reported Lieutenant Chen from the AI Coordination Console. "Response algorithms are processing threat data from 23 different intelligence sources and updating tactical recommendations every 30 seconds.
Emily nodded with satisfaction. Her distributed command structure was performing exactly as designed, allowing regional commanders to respond to immediate civilian threats while maintaining strategic coordination across the entire operation. Traditional centralized command would have been overwhelmed by the complexity and scale of the developing humanitarian crisis. "Lieutenant Commander Patterson," Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the secure communication system, "I have Admiral Sterling requesting an immediate conference. He's demanding an update on the transition from training to active operations and your authority to implement non-standard procedures." Emily felt her jaw tighten. Even during an active humanitarian crisis with civilian lives at stake,
Sterling continued his campaign to undermine her authority. She glanced at the tactical display, showing American families trapped in increasingly dangerous situations, and made a decision that prioritized life-saving effectiveness over bureaucratic politics. Captain, please inform Admiral Sterling that I'm currently managing active rescue operations with 12,000 civilian lives at stake. I'll provide a comprehensive briefing once immediate threats are neutralized and families are safely aboard rescue vessels. The silence that followed her response suggested that Captain Rodriguez understood the implications. Emily was essentially refusing a direct request from a superior officer during active operations, technically insubordination, but arguably justified by humanitarian necessities. Understood, Lieutenant Commander. I'll handle the communication with Admiral Sterling. As Captain Rodriguez's voice faded, Emily turned her attention to the most critical challenge: coordinating rescue responses across 6 different crisis zones while managing real-time threat evolution that changed faster than traditional command structures could process. All stations, this is Charleston actually. Moldovan armed factions are implementing coordinated civilian targeting across multiple population centers. Transition to Rescue Condition 1. All coordination nodes report readiness status for immediate extraction operations. The responses came back in rapid succession, each representing months of preparation and trust building between Allied forces. Node Alpha operational. Canadian Maritime Command ready for harbor extraction operations. Node Bravo operational. Royal Navy surface groups positioned for coastal evacuation. Node Charlie operational. French Navy helicopter assets prepared for inland extraction. Node Delta operational. German Navy medical facilities ready for casualty processing. Node Echo operational. Spanish Navy logistics teams prepared for mass transportation. Node Foxtrot operational. Italian Navy security teams ready for hostile environment rescue. Each confirmation represented unprecedented cooperation between Allied forces that had never worked together using these methods. Emily's coordination protocols had transformed traditional competition and bureaucratic delays into seamless international cooperation, creating a rescue network capable of responding to multiple simultaneous crises. Contact bearing 045, range 12 nautical miles, announced sonar operator Petty Officer Davis. Multiple small craft signatures moving toward coastal city evacuation site. Speed and formation patterns consistent with coordinated assault on civilian gathering points. Emily processed the information quickly. Armed boats approaching the primary evacuation site could trap thousands of American families between hostile forces and the ocean, creating exactly the kind of humanitarian disaster that traditional sequential rescue protocols couldn't prevent. Node Alpha, this is Charleston actually. Armed craft designated Tango 1 through 7 approaching coastal city evacuation site. Recommend immediate protective positioning to shield civilian extraction operations. Charleston actually, Node Alpha acknowledges. HMCs Halifax and Vancouver moving to intercept positions. Estimated arrival at protective formation 12 minutes. Emily watched the tactical display update as Canadian warships maneuvered to place themselves between hostile forces and vulnerable civilians. Traditional protocols would have required extensive consultation and authorization delays before Allied ships could respond to potential threats. Her coordination system enabled immediate protective response while maintaining appropriate escalation control. Lieutenant Commander, Chen called from the AI coordination station, the system is detecting coordinated communication patterns between faction groups. Signal analysis suggests they're implementing unified command structures specifically designed to counter traditional humanitarian response procedures. Emily had anticipated this development. The factions had studied previous evacuation operations and developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the communication delays and coordination difficulties that plagued traditional multinational rescue efforts. Her adaptive protocols represented the only realistic defense against such sophisticated opposition. Activate Communication Security Protocol 9, Emily ordered. Redirect primary coordination through quantum-encrypted channels and implement frequency hopping for all tactical communications. If they want to intercept our coordination, make them work for every piece of information. The AI coordination system executed her commands within seconds, seamlessly transitioning 47 vessels to secure communication networks without interrupting ongoing rescue operations. Allied commanders experienced no degradation in their ability to coordinate, while hostile forces found themselves targeting empty communication channels. Intelligence Officer Webb reported new developments with increasing urgency. Ma'am, satellite reconnaissance shows faction forces have taken control of the international airport and established heavy weapons positions overlooking the harbor. Time to complete evacuation before they can establish effective fire control is approximately 6 hours at current extraction rates. Emily recognized the escalation pattern. Faction forces would position themselves to threaten rescue operations while maintaining that their activities occur within their sovereign territory. Any Allied response could be characterized as foreign military aggression, creating international complications regardless of the humanitarian necessity. Node Bravo, this is Charleston actually. Hostile forces establishing fire control positions overlooking Harbor City extraction site. Recommend positioning Royal Navy vessels to provide protective cover for civilian loading operations. Charleston actually, Node Bravo acknowledges HMS Westminster and Richmond adjusting positions to provide protective screening of 8 minutes.
Emily felt a moment of satisfaction as her coordination system demonstrated its life-saving effectiveness. British vessels would establish protective positions before hostile forces could threaten civilian evacuation, preventing the humanitarian disaster that traditional response protocols would have allowed through their delays. The secure communication system activated again, and Admiral Walsh's face appeared on the display. Her expression was tense but determined, with the Crisis Management Center at Norfolk visible behind her, showing multiple screens tracking the humanitarian situation in real time. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, Situation Report on Operation Safe Harbor. Admiral, Moldovan factions are implementing coordinated civilian targeting operations across 6 population centers. All coordination nodes are operational and responding according to rescue protocols. No civilian casualties reported yet, but hostile forces are positioning to threaten extraction operations. "What's your assessment of faction objectives?" Admiral Walsh asked, studying the tactical data streaming across her displays. Emily had been analyzing this question since the crisis escalated beyond all projections. "Admiral, they're testing our coordination integration while looking for exploitation opportunities that would allow them to take American hostages for political leverage. Traditional sequential rescue methods would leave civilians exposed for hours while we establish security at each site individually. Our dynamic coordination is denying them those opportunities." Admiral Walsh nodded approvingly. "Lieutenant Commander, I've been monitoring the operation from Norfolk. Your coordination is the most effective multinational humanitarian response I've witnessed in 30 years of naval service. However, Admiral Sterling has escalated his concerns to the Secretary of Defense. Political pressure is mounting to implement traditional procedures regardless of their effectiveness." Emily felt her stomach drop. Secretary-level involvement meant that political considerations could override operational effectiveness regardless of results, potentially condemning civilians to death through bureaucratic interference. "What are Admiral Sterling's specific allegations?" Emily asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Unauthorized deployment of untested systems during active operations, deviation from established rescue protocols, and potential compromise of civilian safety through experimental procedures," Walsh replied. "He's arguing that your innovations represent reckless experimentation using American civilians as test subjects." Emily recognized the careful wording designed to make life-saving innovation sound like dangerous recklessness. Sterling was framing her proven improvements as unauthorized experiments rather than superior methods, using bureaucratic language to undermine operational success. "Admiral, every aspect of the coordination system has been validated under actual crisis conditions. The Cyprus evacuation proved these exact protocols against similar multi-faction threats, saving 800 lives with 0 casualties.
I know, Lieutenant Commander, but Sterling is arguing that the current operation scale exceeds previous validation parameters, making this an unauthorized field experiment using Allied forces and civilian lives as test subjects. Emily understood the political trap perfectly. Success would be attributed to lucky experimentation rather than superior planning, while any problems would validate Sterling's criticism of her methods. There was no scenario that would satisfy his predetermined conclusions about her capabilities. Admiral Walsh, what are my current authorities regarding the operation? Full rescue command until the crisis resolves or higher authority intervenes. However, Secretary Martinez wants a real-time briefing on the situation within 90 minutes. You'll need to demonstrate that your methods are not only effective but absolutely necessary to prevent civilian casualties. Emily checked her chronometer. 90 minutes to prove that her coordination protocols could successfully extract 12,000 civilians while maintaining Allied unity and avoiding international complications. The briefing would occur while managing active rescue operations, adding political performance requirements to an already complex humanitarian crisis. Understood, Admiral. I'll provide comprehensive documentation of all operational decisions and their life-saving results. As Admiral Walsh's communication ended, Emily reflected on the cruel irony of her situation. She was successfully coordinating the most complex multinational humanitarian rescue in Atlantic Fleet history, saving thousands of civilian lives through innovative methods that her peers recognized as revolutionary. But her career remained threatened by an admiral who prioritized procedural compliance over human survival. Lieutenant Commander, Petty Officer Davis called urgently. Multiple new contacts bearing 180 range 8 nautical miles. Signature analysis indicates heavy transport helicopters approaching Harbor City from Finland positions. Flight patterns suggest civilian evacuation rather than military movement. Emily felt the crisis shift into a new phase. If those helicopters carried American civilians fleeing inland violence, they would need immediate coordination with ongoing harbor extraction operations. But if they carried hostile forces disguised as evacuees, they could threaten every rescue vessel in the area. No Delta, this is Charleston actually. Unknown helicopter formation approaching Harbor City evacuation site. Aircraft could contain civilians requiring immediate assistance or hostile forces planning assault on rescue operations. Recommend defensive positioning with humanitarian protocols. Charleston actually, no Delta acknowledges. German Navy medical ships prepared for civilian casualty processing while security teams maintain protective posture, ready for either humanitarian assistance or defensive action. Emily watched multiple scenarios unfold simultaneously on her tactical display. Her coordination system was managing 17 separate rescue operations while tracking 34 potential threats and coordinating the movements of 6 Allied navies that had never worked together under these conditions. The next few hours would test whether Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson had created a rescue system capable of saving thousands of lives under impossible conditions, or whether Admiral Sterling's traditional methods would prove more reliable when American civilians faced their darkest hour. Unknown to Emily, within those approaching helicopters was a VIP passenger whose rescue would soon become more important than any career considerations. Admiral Sterling himself, trapped by the very crisis he had dismissed as manageable through conventional procedures. But that revelation was still hours away, and Emily had thousands of other lives to save first.
The storm was reaching its peak, and Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson stood at its center, proving that leadership meant making life-or-death decisions rather than following comfortable rules. The question was no longer whether her innovations could succeed. They were already saving lives. The question was whether institutional politics would allow that success to continue when it mattered most. The helicopter explosion that lit up the Moldavian coastline at 16:47 hours would later be remembered as the moment when Admiral Robert Sterling discovered that his career-long faith in traditional procedures could not save him from modern warfare's brutal realities. Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson watched through high-definition surveillance feeds as one of the approaching transport helicopters erupted in flames, struck by a shoulder-fired missile from faction forces that had infiltrated the supposed safe zones around Harbor City.
Charleston Actual, this is a no-delta emergency. The voice of German Navy Captain Klaus Brenner crackled through the communication system with barely controlled urgency. Helicopter Alpha 7 has been shot down 3 kilometers inland. We have confirmed survivors on the ground, including high-value personnel requiring immediate extraction. Hostile forces are converging on the crash site. Emily felt her blood run cold as the implications registered. High-value personnel meant someone important enough to warrant special mention during active rescue operations, likely a senior military officer or government official who had been attempting to reach the evacuation site when faction forces turned the supposed civilian transport into a target of opportunity. No Delta, what's the identity of the high-value personnel? Emily asked, though she suspected the answer would complicate everything about the rescue operation. Captain Brenner's response confirmed her worst fears. Charleston Actual, preliminary identification indicates Admiral Robert Sterling, Atlantic Fleet Strategic Planning Command, was aboard the downed aircraft along with his aide and 2 civilian contractors. Admiral Sterling was conducting a personal assessment of evacuation procedures when the aircraft was struck. The irony was staggering and cruel. Admiral Sterling, who had spent months arguing that Emily's coordination methods were unnecessarily complex and dangerous, was now trapped in the very crisis he had dismissed as manageable through traditional procedures. His life now depended on the innovative rescue protocols he had tried to destroy. Emily pushed aside any personal feelings about Sterling's predicament. Regardless of their professional conflicts, he was an American officer in enemy territory, and her duty was clear. But she also understood that this rescue would be far more complex than standard civilian evacuation. It would require precisely the kind of adaptive coordination that Sterling had opposed. All nodes, this is Charleston Actual. Priority rescue mission designated Alpha 7 crash site. Admiral Sterling and 3 personnel trapped in hostile territory. Faction forces converging on location. This is now a combat rescue operation requiring full coordination protocol activation. The response from Allied commanders was immediate and professional, despite the personal complications that Sterling's presence created for Emily's career. Node Alpha is ready to provide helicopter escort and air support for the extraction operation. Node Bravo preparing fast attack craft for coastal insertion if required. Node Charlie positioning medical helicopter with trauma teams for casualty evacuation. Node Delta coordinating overland rescue approach with armored personnel carriers. Node Echo establishing communication relay and fire support coordination. Node Foxtrot providing logistics support and extraction route security. Emily watched her coordination system automatically calculate optimal rescue approaches while accounting for hostile positions, terrain challenges, weather conditions, and the medical status of crash survivors. The AI processed thousands of variables that would have overwhelmed traditional command structures, providing her with actionable options within minutes rather than hours. Intelligence update from satellite reconnaissance reported Lieutenant Commander Webb. Faction forces have established a 2-kilometer perimeter around the crash site with approximately 40 combatants. They appear to be attempting to capture rather than eliminate the survivors, suggesting they recognize the political value of taking American military personnel hostage. Emily recognized the tactical situation immediately. Faction forces wanted to capture Sterling alive to use him in international negotiations, which gave them a narrow window of opportunity before the Admiral disappeared into hostile territory permanently. Node Delta, what's your assessment of overland rescue feasibility? Emily asked, studying the terrain analysis that showed steep hills, dense forests, and multiple defensive positions between the coast and the crash site. Charleston Actual, German rescue teams estimate 60% probability of success using current approach routes. Heavy casualties expected due to prepared defensive positions and superior enemy numbers. 60% success probability with heavy casualties was unacceptable for a rescue operation, especially when the person being rescued had spent months undermining the very innovations that offered better alternatives. Emily made a decision that would either save Sterling's life or end her career definitively.
All nodes, we're implementing the Tactical Coordination Protocol Delta 7. Instead of traditional sequential rescue approaches, we'll execute simultaneous multi-vector extraction designed to overwhelm enemy defensive positions. Protocol Delta 7 was Emily's most controversial tactical innovation, a coordinated assault using humanitarian rescue assets in ways that blurred the line between military and civilian operations. Sterling himself had criticized it as dangerously aggressive for rescue missions, arguing that it violated established principles of civilian protection. Node Alpha initiated diversionary helicopter operations to draw faction attention toward the northern approach. Node Bravo positioned fast attack craft for shore bombardment of enemy positions if necessary. Node Charlie prepare medical evacuation immediately behind the primary rescue force. Node Delta coordinates the main rescue assault using adaptive approach routes. Node Echo maintain communication jamming to prevent faction coordination. Node Foxtrot establish extraction route security and prepare for rapid casualty evacuation.
The coordination system displayed the complex operation unfolding in real time, with 6 Allied navies executing a rescue mission that required split-second timing and unprecedented cooperation. Traditional command structures would have required hours of planning and authorization that Sterling couldn't survive. "Lieutenant Commander," Captain Rodriguez's voice carried tension through the communication system. "Secretary Martinez is requesting an immediate briefing on the Sterling rescue operation. Political implications are significant if we fail to extract him successfully." Emily understood the political reality perfectly. If Sterling died or was captured because she had implemented non-traditional rescue methods, his death would validate every criticism he had made about her innovations. But if traditional methods failed to save him, her career would be destroyed anyway for not using every available tool to rescue a senior officer. "Captain, please inform Secretary Martinez that I'm implementing emergency rescue protocols specifically designed for high-value personnel extraction under hostile conditions. Full briefing will follow once Admiral Sterling is safely aboard Allied vessels." As Emily coordinated the most complex rescue operation of her career, she reflected on the cruel irony that Sterling's survival depended entirely on methods he had opposed. Her adaptive coordination protocols were the only realistic option for extracting him from a situation that traditional sequential approaches couldn't handle effectively. "Node Delta began primary rescue approach," reported Captain Brenner. "German combat engineers have cleared the outer defensive perimeter, advancing toward the crash site under covering fire from Node Echo positions." Emily watched the tactical display show Allied forces moving in coordinated patterns that would have been impossible without her AI-assisted coordination system. Each unit knew exactly where friendly forces were positioned, preventing the communication failures that traditionally caused casualties during complex rescue operations. "Contact with survivors established," came the report from the rescue team leader. "Admiral Sterling is conscious but injured. Compound fracture of left leg, possible concussion, requires immediate medical evacuation. 2 other personnel were seriously wounded but stable." Emily felt relief that Sterling was alive, followed immediately by concern about extraction challenges. Injured personnel would slow the rescue operation while faction forces closed in on their position. "Node Charlie, medical evacuation helicopter ready for immediate extraction," reported the French Navy Coordination Center. "Trauma teams prepared for compound fracture treatment and head injury assessment." "All nodes, hostile forces are massing for a final assault on the rescue team position," Webb announced urgently. "Estimated time before the enemy overruns the extraction site approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes to extract injured personnel from a defensive position 3 kilometers inland while under fire from superior enemy forces. Traditional sequential evacuation would require at least 15 minutes, guaranteeing that Sterling would be captured or killed." Emily made the decision that would define both their careers. "All nodes, execute simultaneous extraction protocols. Node Alpha, begin maximum intensity diversionary assault. Node Bravo initiates shore bombardment of faction positions. Node Delta, extract all personnel immediately regardless of medical protocol limitations. Node Charlie, prepare for a hot landing zone medical evacuation. The next 6 minutes unfolded like a deadly symphony conducted by artificial intelligence and executed by human courage. Allied forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming faction defensive positions that had been designed to counter traditional rescue approaches. Emily's coordination system managed the chaos with precision that no human commander could match, ensuring that supporting fire never endangered friendly forces while maximizing pressure on enemy positions. Extraction successful, Captain Brenner's voice carried triumph and relief. All 4 personnel recovered. Admiral Sterling stable for transport, returning to Allied positions under escort. Emily felt a surge of professional satisfaction mixed with the sobering knowledge that she had just saved the life of an officer who had spent months trying to destroy her career. Her controversial rescue protocols had succeeded where traditional methods would have failed catastrophically. Node Charlie, a medical helicopter, secured survivors and departed for Charleston medical facilities. Admiral Sterling was conscious and demanded immediate communication with Fleet Command. Even injured and rescued by methods he had opposed, Sterling apparently wanted to resume command authority as quickly as possible. Emily wondered whether his experience being saved by her innovations would change his perspective about their value, or whether institutional pride would prevent him from acknowledging their effectiveness. The secure communication system activated, showing Admiral Walsh's face with Secretary of Defense Martinez visible behind her. Both senior officials looked relieved but concerned about the political implications of the rescue operation. Lieutenant Commander Patterson, preliminary reports indicate that Admiral Sterling has been successfully extracted from hostile territory using your coordination protocols. His survival appears to be directly attributable to the innovative rescue methods you implemented. Emily maintained professional composure despite feeling vindicated by the results. Thank you, Madam Secretary. The coordination system performed as designed under extreme conditions. Allied cooperation was exceptional throughout the operation. Lieutenant Commander, Admiral Walsh continued, Admiral Sterling has requested immediate briefing on the rescue operation and the status of ongoing civilian evacuations. He's particularly interested in understanding how your coordination protocols achieved results that traditional methods couldn't have matched. The irony was complete. Sterling wanted to understand the very innovations he had spent months trying to suppress. Innovations that had just saved his life when traditional procedures would have left him dead or captured in enemy territory. Admiral Walsh, I'll provide a comprehensive briefing as soon as Admiral Sterling is medically cleared for operational discussions. The civilian evacuation continues with over 8,000 Americans already safely extracted using the same coordination methods that rescued the Admiral. As the communication ended, Emily reflected on the extraordinary reversal that had occurred in the span of 6 hours. The Admiral who had declared she would never make captain was alive only because her supposedly dangerous innovations had proved superior to his traditional methods when his own life hung in the balance. But Emily also knew that Sterling's rescue was just the beginning. 7,000 civilians remained trapped in increasingly dangerous territory, and faction forces would likely escalate their tactics after losing their chance to capture a high-value American military officer. The coordination protocols that had saved Sterling would now be tested on an even larger scale, with the eyes of the Pentagon focused on every decision Emily made. Success could revolutionize humanitarian operations and validate her entire approach to modern crisis management. Failure would vindicate Sterling's opposition regardless of his personal debt to her innovations. The storm was far from over, and Lieutenant Commander Emily Patterson stood at its center, having proved that her methods could save the life of her greatest critic. Now she had to prove they could save thousands more, while navigating the political complexities of a rescue operation that had become far more than a humanitarian crisis. It had become a test of whether innovation could overcome institutional resistance when lives depended on the outcome. 6 months later, Captain Emily Patterson stood on the bridge of the USS Charleston, now flagship of the Atlantic Fleet's Humanitarian Response Command, watching the largest multinational rescue exercise in naval history unfold according to coordination protocols that had become the new standard for Allied operations. 49 vessels from 8 nations moved in perfect synchronization, their actions guided by AI systems that processed life-saving decisions faster than any human commander could manage. The transformation had been extraordinary. What began as institutional resistance to innovation had evolved into enthusiastic adoption as the effectiveness of integrated coordination became undeniable. Allied navies that had initially questioned Emily's methods now competed to implement them most effectively, recognizing that her protocols represented the future of humanitarian operations. Admiral Sterling approached Emily on the bridge, walking with only a slight limp that remained from his injuries in Moldavia. His presence carried none of the hostility that had characterized their previous interactions. Operation Safe Harbor had fundamentally changed his perspective about innovation versus tradition. "Captain Patterson," Sterling said, studying the tactical displays showing unprecedented coordination across vast distances. "Your protocols have fundamentally transformed how we approach humanitarian crises. The Moldavian operation saved over 11,000 civilian lives with 0 casualties among rescue personnel. Those results speak for themselves." Emily nodded, understanding that Sterling's acknowledgement represented more than professional recognition. It was institutional validation of methods that challenged decades of established doctrine. "Admiral, the coordination system works because it adapts to crisis realities rather than forcing crises to fit predetermined procedures. As long as we continue evolving faster than the threats we face, we can save more lives." "Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" Sterling asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than the dismissive skepticism Emily remembered from their previous encounters. Emily considered the question carefully, reflecting on the journey from dismissed junior officer to fleet captain. "Admiral, every challenge I faced taught me something essential about leadership and innovation. Your initial opposition forced me to develop methods that were more robust and effective than anything I could have created without that institutional pressure." Sterling's expression showed acceptance of his role in that development. "Captain, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. My assessment of your capabilities was based on adherence to familiar procedures rather than evaluation of actual results. When my own life depended on your innovations, I learned the difference between comfortable traditions and effective solutions." As the exercise continued, Emily watched young officers from multiple nations learning coordination techniques that would define their entire careers. Among them, she noticed Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, a promising strategist whose innovative approaches to crisis management were being enthusiastically received by senior commanders. Emily approached Martinez during a brief operational pause. "Lieutenant, your suggestions for improving medical coordination integration show exceptional strategic thinking. Have you considered specializing in humanitarian operations planning?" Martinez's face lit up with professional enthusiasm. "Captain, I'd be honored to contribute to the development of coordination protocols. Your work during the Moldavian crisis inspired an entire generation of naval officers to think beyond traditional limitations." Emily smiled, remembering her own excitement when senior officers had first recognized her potential years earlier. "Lieutenant, submit your ideas through formal channels. The Navy needs officers who can think creatively about saving lives rather than just following established procedures." As Emily returned to her command duties, she reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred since that morning when Sterling had declared she would never make captain. The prediction had been spectacularly wrong, not because Emily had proved him personally incorrect, but because she had transformed the entire definition of what effective naval leadership could accomplish. The secure communication system activated, showing Admiral Walsh on the main display. Her expression carried the satisfaction of someone who had supported innovation when institutional pressure favored conformity. "Captain Patterson, I have excellent news. The Joint Chiefs have approved implementation of your coordination protocols across all Atlantic Fleet's humanitarian operations. You're being promoted to Rear Admiral and assigned as Director of Advanced Humanitarian Coordination, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense." Emily felt the weight of validation and expanded responsibility settle simultaneously. The promotion to Rear Admiral represented complete vindication of her methods, but the assignment meant that her innovations would be tested on an even larger scale, with correspondingly greater consequences for failure. "Thank you, Admiral Walsh. I'm honored by the confidence and ready to serve in whatever capacity best supports our mission to save civilian lives during international crises." As the communication ended, Emily noticed Admiral Sterling observing the exchange with evident approval. His transformation from opponent to supporter had been complete, driven by the undeniable reality that her methods had saved his life when traditional procedures would have failed. "Admiral Patterson," Sterling said, using her new rank with obvious respect, "there's one more thing you should know. The Pentagon has established the Sterling Patterson Institute for Advanced Humanitarian Coordination. My name is attached in recognition that opposition to innovation can ultimately strengthen it, while your name represents the courage to challenge institutional assumptions when lives depend on better solutions." Emily felt a complex mixture of emotions regarding the institute designation. Having her name linked with Sterling's represented the ultimate reconciliation between innovation and tradition, showing that institutional resistance could evolve into institutional support when results proved superior to established methods. The final scene of Emily's remarkable journey occurred during the Institute's dedication ceremony 3 months later. She stood at the podium in Norfolk Naval Base's main auditorium, addressing an audience of senior officers from 12 allied nations who had come to learn coordination methods that had revolutionized humanitarian operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emily began, "the protocols we'll teach here represent more than tactical innovations. They represent a fundamental commitment to adapting our methods to serve our mission rather than forcing our mission to fit comfortable procedures. When civilian lives hang in the balance, our obligation is to use whatever tools prove most effective, regardless of whether they challenge traditional approaches." In the front row, Admiral Sterling sat with obvious pride, his presence symbolizing the transformation that could occur when institutional leaders were willing to acknowledge that innovation could improve upon even the most established traditions. As the ceremony concluded and officers from multiple nations committed to implementing coordination protocols that would save countless lives in future crises, Emily reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Every obstacle had ultimately strengthened her resolve and improved her capabilities. Every critic had forced her to develop better solutions than she could have created without their opposition. Rear Admiral Emily Patterson had proved that the most powerful response to those who say never is not to argue with their limitations, but to build a better tomorrow that makes their objections irrelevant. The admiral who said she'd never make captain had been completely wrong, not because Emily had proved him wrong through personal achievement, but because she had transformed what naval leadership could accomplish when innovation served humanity rather than institutional comfort. The Atlantic was safer, the alliance was stronger, and the future belonged to those willing to embrace its challenges rather than retreat into familiar procedures. Emily had shown that true leadership meant making decisions that saved lives rather than following rules that preserved careers. In the end, Admiral Sterling's greatest contribution to the Navy wasn't his decades of traditional service, it was his eventual recognition that opposing innovation could ultimately strengthen it when that opposition forced innovators to develop solutions so superior that even their critics had to acknowledge their value. Rear Admiral Emily Patterson had saved Admiral Sterling's life using methods he had tried to destroy. But more importantly, she had saved the concept that military institutions could evolve to serve their missions more effectively rather than simply preserve their traditions more comfortably. The rescue mission that began with saving one admiral's life had ended with transforming how the entire Navy approached its obligation to protect civilian lives during humanitarian crises. The story was complete, but the mission continued every day as officers trained in Emily's methods deployed around the world, ready to save lives using coordination protocols that had been forged in opposition and proven under the most challenging conditions imaginable. 2 years after the Moldovan crisis, the ripple effects of Emily's innovations had spread far beyond naval operations. The Department of Homeland Security adopted modified versions of her coordination protocols for disaster response, enabling federal agencies to work together with unprecedented efficiency during Hurricane Victoria's devastating impact on the Gulf Coast. FEMA, Coast Guard, National Guard, and local emergency services coordinated through AI-assisted systems that prevented the communication breakdowns that had characterized previous disaster responses. International humanitarian organizations requested access to the coordination technologies, recognizing that Emily's methods could revolutionize refugee assistance and disaster relief operations worldwide. The United Nations Emergency Coordination Office established a partnership with the Sterling Patterson Institute to train civilian disaster response teams using military-grade coordination systems adapted for humanitarian purposes. Emily's influence extended into unexpected areas as major corporations began implementing similar coordination principles for supply chain management and crisis response. Technology companies developed civilian applications of her AI-assisted decision-making systems, creating tools that helped hospitals coordinate during medical emergencies and helped cities manage traffic flow during evacuations. The transformation wasn't limited to American institutions. NATO established the Allied Humanitarian Coordination Center in Brussels, with Emily serving as its first director while maintaining her naval responsibilities. The center became the model for international crisis response, demonstrating how different nations could maintain their sovereignty while working together more effectively than ever before. During the center's inaugural crisis response, coordinating assistance for earthquake victims across 3 countries simultaneously, Emily watched her protocols save over 50,000 lives in the first week alone. Traditional sequential response methods would have required months to achieve similar results, by which time countless additional casualties would have occurred. The personal cost of Emily's success had been significant. The intense demands of transforming institutional cultures while managing life-or-death operations had strained relationships and required sacrifices that few outside the military could understand. But standing in the Brussels Coordination Center, watching nations that had historically competed instead collaborate seamlessly to save lives, Emily knew that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. Admiral Sterling, now serving as Deputy Secretary of Defense for Humanitarian Operations, often visited the center to observe the protocols in action. His presence served as a powerful reminder that even the strongest institutional resistance could evolve into institutional support when confronted with undeniable results. Admiral Patterson, Sterling said during one such visit, watching coordination displays show real-time disaster response across 4 continents. "When I first met you," Sterling said, "I thought the Navy's strength came from maintaining proven traditions. I've learned that our real strength comes from our ability to evolve those traditions to serve our mission more effectively." Emily nodded, understanding that Sterling's journey from opponent to advocate represented something larger than personal transformation. It demonstrated that institutions could change when leaders were willing to prioritize mission effectiveness over comfortable familiarity. The Sterling Patterson Institute had grown beyond Emily's original vision, becoming a global center for crisis coordination research and training. Officers from 47 countries had graduated from its programs, carrying Emily's methods back to their home nations and adapting them to local conditions and cultural requirements. The Institute's research division continued developing new applications for coordination technology, exploring how artificial intelligence could enhance human decision-making during increasingly complex global crises. Climate change, cyber warfare, pandemic response, and mass migration all required the kind of adaptive coordination that Emily had pioneered during the Moldovan operation.
Emily's legacy was being written not just in naval history, but in the lives saved by graduates who applied her principles during disasters and crises around the world. Every successful evacuation, every coordinated disaster response, every international cooperation that worked seamlessly because of her innovations represented validation of the belief that institutional resistance to necessary change could be overcome through persistent excellence and demonstrated results. The final measure of Emily's impact wasn't her promotion or the institutions named in her honor. It was the quiet knowledge that thousands of families remained intact because her innovations had enabled faster, more effective responses to humanitarian crises. Children who might have been orphaned were reunited with parents. Communities that might have been devastated were rebuilt through coordinated international assistance. Nations that might have struggled alone instead worked together through systems that make cooperation more effective than competition. Rear Admiral Emily Patterson had proved that true leadership meant more than advancing through organizational hierarchies. It meant transforming those organizations to serve their missions more effectively, even when that transformation required challenging every comfortable assumption about how things should be done. The admiral who said she'd never make captain had been proven wrong in ways he never could have imagined. Emily hadn't just made captain, she had redefined what naval leadership could accomplish when innovation served humanity rather than institutional tradition. Her story became required reading at naval academies worldwide, inspiring new generations of officers to question whether established procedures were serving their missions as effectively as possible. The rescue mission that began with saving one admiral's life had ended with transforming how military and civilian institutions worldwide approach their obligation to protect and serve humanity during its most vulnerable moments. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.